And with that, we want to welcome you to tonight's webinar featuring artist Robert Shetterly, who will talk about his series of portrait paintings titled Americans Who Tell the Truth, which depicts 265 activists, including World Beyond War's board president, Kathy Kelly, and World Beyond War's executive director, David Swanson. And I will pass it over to Larry Gilbert, who is the chapter coordinator for the World Beyond War Florida chapter. And Larry will be introducing today's event. So go ahead, Larry.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. And it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Robert Shetterly. Robert was born in 1946 in Cincinnati, Ohio. He graduated in 1969 from Harvard College with a degree in English literature. At Harvard, he took some courses in drawing, which changed the direction of his creative life. So from the written word to the image. Also, during this time, he was active in civil rights and in the anti-Vietnam War movement. After college and moving to Maine in 1970, he taught himself drawing, printmaking, and painting. Robert's paintings and prints are in collections all over the United States and Europe. He is well known for his scenes of 70 painted etchings based on William Blake's Proverbs of Hell, and for another series of 50 paintings, 50 painted etchings reflecting on the metaphor of the Annunciation. His painting has tended toward the narrative and the surreal. However, for more than 20 years, he has been painting the series of portraits, Americans Who Tell the Truth. There are now nearly 270 portraits in the exhibit. Portraits from the exhibit have been traveling around the country since 2003. The portraits have given Shetterly an opportunity to speak with children and adults all over the country about the necessity of dissent in a democracy, the obligation of citizenship, sustainability, U.S. history, and how democracy cannot function if politicians don't tell the truth, if the media don't report it, and if the people don't demand it. Shetterly has engaged in a wide variety of activist and humanitarian work with many of the people whose portraits he has painted. In the spring of 2007, he traveled to Rwanda with Lily Ye and Terry Tempest Williams to work in a village of survivors of the 1994 genocide there. And then to Palestine twice with Lily Ye for art projects in refugee camps. Much of his current work focuses on the intersection of climate change, capitalism, systemic racism, and militarism. Richard Kane's film Truth Tellers about the Americans Who Tell the Truth project premiered in the fall of 2021 and has been showing across the country. In 2005, the Maine People's Alliance awarded him the Rising Tide Award. And that's usually with a paddle, by the way, the Rising Tide Award. Rob received a Distinguished Achievement Award from the University of Southern Maine and gave the commencement address at the University of New England, which awarded him an honorary doctorate in humane letters in 2009. In 2009, he was named a Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellow that enabled him to do week-long residences in colleges around the country. The University of Maine at Farmington awarded him an honorary doctorate of humane letters in 2011, and in 2023, he received the Ashley Bryant Award for Arts and Humanities from the Maine Education Association. Robert Shetterly lives with his partner, Gail Page, and a painter and children's book writer and illustrator in Brooksville, Maine. Co-sponsored by the Florida for World Beyond War chapter and Veterans for Peace chapter 136, the Villages, Florida. It's my pleasure to present you Robert Shetterly. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Larry. It's a pleasure to be with you and everyone else there, and to have met Greta this evening. I did not know her until now. But anyway, I will talk about a few things. I want to tell a couple of stories first. First, I'll tell a short version of the story, the origin story for Americans Who Tell the Truth. Oops, I just lost my. Can you still see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Oh, everybody else, I see you took your pictures off. Anyways, so I was not a portrait painter. I was a surrealist, and but after 9/11, when the United States government, the George W. Bush administration, started the propaganda for attacking Iraq, I found it living in this country untenable at that moment. I could not stand it any longer. I figured I had to either leave the country or find a way to live here that would enable me to be a full citizen. And so I couldn't figure out what to do. I was so full of rage that this was happening, and so full of incredible grief of all the victims there were going to be if we started this other war. And finally, after a couple of months of just thrashing around, I came up with the idea of, well, why not start surrounding myself with people that make me feel good about the country rather than ranting one more day about Dick Cheney or Donald Rumsfeld or Condoleezza Rice or any of the rest of them. And that decision actually, I think, saved my life. I mean, I was so distraught that I could feel that I was making myself really sick about how I felt about this happening again in this country. I mean, have been here. I'm 76 now. I'll be 77 this year. I've lived through an awful lot of militarism of this country, and everything that has happened since since I've been an adult has been the product of lies and propaganda and deceit and secrecy. And I needed something to heal myself. And I began this project, Americans Who Tell the Truth, really as simply as therapy for myself. So I painted, Walt Whitman, I painted Frederick Douglass, I painted Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Jane Addams and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Alice Paul. I painted all these 19th century icons of one movement or another in this country that was trying to insist that the United States live up to its own ideals. And in the process of doing that, I began to understand a lot about our history, why power is the way it is, who profits by it, and how things actually change. And that was what I didn't expect. I mean, what I was doing when I began this was doing it for myself. And I had these paintings stacked up in my basement, and I really thought that that's where they would stay. And I would, every once in a while, I'd go down and visit with them and reassure myself that there was a history here that was beneficial and worth the ideals. However, I started to show them, and my life changed. People were much more interested in it than I thought. They were inviting me to come and speak. I was invited into schools. I was invited going all over the place. And then I met a man who said he was a former U.S. diplomat, a man named Bob Sargent, who turned out he had actually been in the CIA. but he said he agreed with the politics of what I was doing, and that he understood the what the our government was doing in Iraq, and that he wanted to help me make this a national traveling show. So I was so encouraged by that that I just kept going. My initial idea was to paint 50 portraits, even though I'd never painted one, and I just kept going. You know, in 2.5 years, I had 50 portraits, and then I had they're now, as I said, over 270. Many of the portraits have to do with war and peace and militarism and peacemaking and anti-war things. But I want to tell a couple of little stories about coming face to face with the military-industrial complex, you might say. A few years ago, I got invited to, and then I'll show some pictures of some of the portraits, but I'm guessing a lot of you have seen them. But I want to tell this little story first. I was invited to the Kennedy Center at Harvard to be part of a group that was supposed to be discussing techniques of dealing with PTSD and moral injury, healing techniques. I'm not sure why I was invited. Most of these other people were doing different kinds of therapies. They were doing theater, they were doing writing, they were doing talk therapies, they were doing all these different things. And a lot of them were incredibly imaginative. I was just so impressed with all those people. There were probably 30 people in this group. And maybe whoever organized it thought that what I was doing as an artist was and attempting to be a project about truth telling, that maybe that was therapeutic too. But so at one point, after we'd all introduced ourselves and gone around this big circle and explained what it was that each of us did, a head honcho from the Kennedy Center came in, and he, with his nice Armani suit and his flip chart and his magic marker, and he started going around the room and putting on this flip chart what each person, was saying about how they were trying to attempt to treat PTSD and moral injury. And just by chance, I was the last person in the room to be asked about this. And, like, what can we do about these problems? And so I looked at him and I said, well, obviously the most sensible thing to do would be not to have the wars. And he looked at me with a look of incredulity and also, you might say, daggers, and refused to write what I said up on the chart, that no war was a good solution to PTSD or moral injury. So I didn't want to get into a big fight at that moment, but I thought, this will come around again and we'll have a discussion. And a little later, he came back and he wanted to get some highlights from people, some of their personal stories of what each one of them was doing. And sitting next to me was a Marine, former Marine, or maybe he was still a Marine, anyway, who had been in both Afghanistan and Iraq, who was clearly suffering himself, but was trying to use the suffering that he was going through to treat other soldiers with these problems. And so he told about how difficult it was, and the things that he did, and how he could use his own experience and all that stuff. And so after he had told that, I said to him, well, how much harder does it make it to treat soldiers who are suffering this kind of trauma if they find out that the reasons that they witnessed the things they did, witnessed the things they witnessed, did the things they did, had the things that were done to them, how much harder does it make it if they find out it was all for a lie? And the man kind of exploded. I mean, in a way, he just went almost, so distraught. And he said, well, then you can't treat anybody. He said, all they do is, they're suicidal. It's awful. You can't treat them. And I looked at this man who had refused to write up no war before, and kind of gave him that look, well, there you go. And what was brought home there was, you all know, and I'm sure any one of you could probably tell a version of the same story. But what was so interesting to me was that here in this bastion, in the highest bastion of academia, that is also the swinging and revolving door between the Pentagon and the politicians and the weapons makers and all that world, the contractors, everybody, they're all the same people. They go back and forth, that they can't even, write down on a flip chart that a solution to problems like this would be to not have war. So I wanted to just say that, tell that little story. And then I wanted to read quickly a poem by Tony Hoagland. Some of you probably know Tony Hoagland. I know that one of the people on this webinar tonight is Doug Rawlings, who's one of my other favorite poets and favorite people. And this is a poem by Tony Hoagland, who's also a friend of Doug's, Tony died a few years ago. It's called New Strategy. He says, instead of attacking one more foreign city, hammering it into rubble, we adopt a new strategy and start bombing with money. We fill canisters with dollars instead of explosives, drop them from planes, and they splash open on the streets and temples and malls. They fill the artillery cannons with all the cash it would take to make more artillery cannons, and we launch it at schools and at embassies. Instead of paratroopers, we drop only their combat boots, floating on small silk parachutes, beautiful boots full of chocolate and money. Instead of leaflets, we drop clouds of rubles and dinar, euros, and yen. Instead of blowing up bridges, we airlift bales of red carpet at night. And when dawn unfurls, all the bridges are red, as fresh blood, but deep and soft and easy on the feet. Confused and happy, the populace is flooded with millionaires. Instead of a country of one-armed, one-eyed, and one-legged men, a place of Volvo mechanics and art gallery openings. The secret police move to the country and take up the violin. Their daughters become engineers and fashion designers. Everyone gives up their demands. What looked like a problem is no longer a problem. The war was expensive, says the president, but it was worth every cent. And he smiles that $1 million inextinguishable smile that implies what money is worth. Good shoes and dental whitening agents and quiet at night for deep, peaceful sleep, which is treasured by people everywhere. That poem, on the one hand, sounds, kind of ridiculous and surreally naive, but of course it isn't really that. And one of the things that I think is implied by Tony Hoagland is that in fact, as we do drop all this very, expensive and unbelievably cruel, brutal ordinance on people around the world, we are simultaneously dropping, those canisters of money on the weapons manufacturers, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Grumman, et cetera, et cetera. All that money is being dropped on them. And that's one of the reasons why I got that reception that I did at the JFK school. And as you all know, that's one of the things that drives all this stuff. So one other little thing I was interested in, and I hope that later we have a chance to talk about it a little bit. The other night on Netflix, well, actually over several nights, I watched that Netflix series about Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family and OxyContin. It's the show called Painkiller. Maybe a lot of you have seen it, which, you look at it and you're just amazed at the duplicity, the greed, the corruption of that family. It comes so probably as no big surprise to anybody in this country that the pharmaceutical industry behaves like that, that it is written into their project is the ethic of collateral damage, and the more the merrier, because then the more money for them. And as I was watching that, though, I was thinking, now why is that so different between the way people think about the pharmaceutical industry and the way they think about militarism in this country. When we have the same kind of duplicity, the same kind of corruption, the same kind of ethic of murder and collateral damage, and the same problem with an exorbitant amount of money. Why does the military industry get a pass, whereas the pharmaceutical companies don't? And I think, the answer to that is really important for all of us to think about all the different ways that we can all see what's going on, and then not other people can't see it, at least enough to want to do anything about it in any serious way. So now I'm going to share the screen and talk about a few portraits. Is this, wait a minute, did I? Yes, this is, I'm going to, sorry, they're not moving just the way I want to know. Wait a second. Oops. Here we go. So this was one of the very early portraits. I started with 19th century figures, except for a few 20th century people who were extremely important to me at that time. This is Wendell Berry. I'm sure a lot of you know him mostly as an environmental ethicist, farmer from Port Royal, Kentucky. He was a great poet as well as a writer of essays and novels. And he wrote an essay at the end in which the last sentence is this line, which I scratched into the portrait. And the method I adopted to make the portraits was to not just try to paint a pretty good portrait of somebody and do it in such a way that you look right at the person and he or she looks right at you and you have a sort of intense contact, was to put a quote from that person on the portrait that tells you why they're looking like that. And so this quote, the most alarming sign of the state of our society now is that our leaders have the courage to sacrifice the lives of young people in war, but have not the courage to tell us that we must be less greedy and less wasteful. That, to me, finding that quote and putting it on this portrait was really important, because as I began to get invited into schools, and here's the surprising thing, is that, carrying this message, you would think that most schools in this country would not want me there, because, to read things like this to middle school kids, high school kids, college kids in churches and libraries, do they really want to deal with this kind of thing? But because of the art, and this is an important lesson for all of us too, about how we get a platform to talk at times, to deliver the message, to get people asking questions and thinking, is that sometimes we can do it with art, whereas if you were to, go in as, just talking about the person or, as that person themselves, you might not be allowed in there. But I get, in a high school class, you read a quote like that, and you say, well, what is Wendell Berry talking about? What kind of courage does it take to sacrifice the lives of young people in war? And why is that a lesser courage or an easier courage, if you can, he's being ironic, of course, it's not courage at all, but then telling people to be less wasteful or less greedy? And you just ask kids that and let them think about it. And they get it after a while. They talk about it, and then somebody says, well, it's because the economy runs on waste and greed. And so they don't want to stop that in any way, that the economy is actually more critical to them, the welfare of the economy, than the lives of their own children. And when they begin to get that idea in their heads, when they analyze a quote like this, that's an amazing moment. So let me tell you, I'm going to jump to some other people here. I mean, something else there. I want to tell this story. I don't know how many of you know who Kali Rubahi is. She, Wendell Berry was one of my first portraits. Kali Rubahi is I just did a year or so ago. She's an anthropologist, an Iraqi-American anthropologist at Purdue University. And, you know, when it was it must have been a summer before last when the PACT Act was passed in the United States, the idea of which was to give money to especially veterans organizations to treat veterans who had been exposed to the toxins from the burn pits in Afghanistan and Iraq, and how because they were so toxic that they were causing all these respiratory and nervous diseases and, you know, other things. Horrible stuff, you know. I mean, just so, and also, of course, the question which wasn't being dealt with at that time was just how incredibly stupid this was, you know, to dispose of all this waste in one place just by burning it in an open pit. One of the interesting things about that was how narcissistic the conversation was, as though people exposed to the toxins from the burn pits and the gases were American soldiers, or at least the only people that it mattered. And Kali Rubahi had been going for a number of years, more than 10 years, to Fallujah and Basra and places like that, and studying the health effects to Iraqi people from burn pits and all the fallout from all the munitions, depleted uranium, the you know, white phosphorus, and just what's left over from the detritus of war making. What effect was that having on the people who weren't there just for, you know, a short time, a year or two, but had to live with this? And, you know, she was documenting that in a lot of these places that the birth defect rate was as high, could be as high as 20%. You know, 1 out of 5 kids born with often horrible, horrible birth defects. And so she has been reporting on this, and she says liberal democratic empires frame imperial terror as defense and the self-defense of targeted people as terrorism. While the US empire may speak of the sanctity of human life, its implementation centers on the sanctity of lethal force. Not only by bullets, but also by triggering a cascade of public health crises and ecological collapse. So we leave these places and leave behind these horrible toxins and an environment often in collapse, as well as, you know, the social structure in collapse. And then don't mention it again. Don't talk about it. Don't hold ourselves at all accountable for it. That's what Kali Rubahi has been trying to wake us all up to. And then there was, see, I want to, a lot of you recognize a lot of these people here. But let's see, I'm sorry, I'm going to fumble around here and send you through these. I want to just say briefly about these two. Again, I suspect that a lot of you know, at least you may know Coleman McCarthy, who is one of the premier, you know, peace studies teachers in this country. I mean, when very little was being done in the terms of teaching peace, he was doing that, you know, riding his bicycle around the streets of Washington, D.C. and going into high schools and for free teaching classes in peacemaking. And he says, you know, give peace a chance, yes, but why not get serious and give it a place in the curriculum? Peace courses in every school, every grade, every nation. Unless we teach our children peace, someone else will teach them violence. And we all know how true that is. And but I wanted to also then tell you about this person, John Hunter. I hope some of you know him or know of him. He's a fourth grade teacher in Charlottesville who, if you haven't seen him talk, there's a TED talk with him, which is extraordinary. But in his fourth grade teacher, as a fourth grade teacher, he decided to do what Cormac McCarthy was talking about, was actually teach kids how to think about making peace in the world. And he thought it would be a good idea to begin with young kids, but not condescend to them at all, to teach them, what the world are, and then how to negotiate peace when you're dealing with the real problems. And he wrote a book called World Peace and Other Fourth Grade Accomplishments. And what he does is in his classrooms is divide the kids up into different teams, and each team represents a different fictional country. But the countries are very much like countries in the real world, and some are rich or some are poor. Some have environmental issues, some don't. Some have resources, some don't. They have all kinds of different problems with income distribution and all sorts of other things. Some have an ethic of militarism. Some have a much more of an ethic of wanting peace in the world. But he sets up the situation with 50 different variables, and then tells the kids, and with all kinds of things going on in the world, and then tells them to figure out how to make peace. And he steps back and lets them figure it out for themselves. What is so powerful about doing this is that the kids do figure it out, that they sometimes start little wars, they do bad things, and they realize that they've been, charged with finding a way to peace, and they back up and they negotiate and they figure out, how to make peace. He gives them one rubric. He tells them that when they do this, that everybody has to come out ahead, that there can't be winners and losers in the countries, that everybody has to come out better than they were initially. And they do it. The fourth graders figure out how to make peace. He does the same experiment with adults, and almost invariably they fail, because they've been so indoctrinated with that idea of winners and losers, and in order for me to have what I want, you can't have what you want, that they can't succeed at the game, his peace game. So this is, I guess, underlines and makes what Cormac McCarthy's saying about teaching peace so important, because if we don't do that, that someone else will teach them violence. In fact, their country will teach them violence, and they will teach themselves to follow that advice and also make violence. And they won't be able to not do it. It's so hard if you haven't been taught how to make peace initially. I wanted to say, gosh, there's Kathy. By the way, that was painted, when was that, Kathy? It was mostly almost 20 years ago, maybe 17, 18 years ago when you were visiting Maine. I wanted to show I wanted to say something about Palestine and Israel. Here. Again, you may know these people. Everybody, you all know Rachel Corrie and what she did. Today, what's been going on in Israel and Palestine, left bank and Gaza, it just keeps, when you think it can't get worse, it gets worse. And Israel seems to be just totally out of control in terms of the violent ethnic cleansing that they are visiting on the people of the West Bank and Gaza. But I thought that I would put these two portraits together just to say a little bit about that and remind us all that what we need to be doing at this moment. So Rachel Corrie, in one of her emails home when she was there shortly before she was run over by that bulldozer, she said the intellectual media are not going to tell us that we are effective, important, justified in our work, courageous, intelligent, valuable. We have to do that for each other. And one way we can do that is by continuing our work visibly. People without privilege will be doing this work no matter what, because they are working for their lives. We can work with them, and they know that we work with them, or we can leave them to do this work themselves and curse us for our complicity in killing them. The point is that, if we don't work with them, we are complicit, which was exactly how I felt when I started painting these portraits, that my country, this country was making me complicit in murder. And I can't, I can't abide that. I've got to find some way to not feel so complicit. Alice Rothschild is a Jewish when they went back, there were family involved in the, killed in the Holocaust. And she, for years, had been trying to figure out how to react to all that, and also to try to tell the real history about what was going on there. And by studying the real history, she moved from a position of being pro-Israel to be in a position of knowing that in order to be honest, she had to tell the truth about what was being done to the Palestinians. And she says, where are the protests from political organizations, the cries of horror from US ministers, as well as rabbis and mainstream Jewish community groups who cry, never again? Surely history will teach us that Israel could not claim a special nation because of past suffering and then behave immorally. Misusing the term anti-Semitism to characterize criticism of Israel behavior ultimately renders the term meaningless. And of course, we still see that today, that political leaders and all kinds of other people are afraid to name what Israel does for what it is, as being proto-fascist at this point and incredibly violent, and because they will be termed anti-Semitic for saying so. I mean, that is a way of holding us all hostage for telling the truth about what's going on in the world and then doing the work that Rachel Corrie calls us to be doing. And I want to say something just about, in that regard, about Ramsey Clark. Ramsey was the Attorney General of this country back in the late 60s and 70s for a while. Or into the 70s. No, just the late 60s, Nixon through LBJ, I think. And however, after he ended his term, he felt enabled to tell the truth about what was going on. And during the first Gulf War, he went and toured the country while the US was bombing. And of course, bombing the same kind of places that Putin is bombing in Ukraine. I mean, bombing hospitals, bombing schools, bombing the sewage treatment plants, bombing the electrical grid, bombing, all over where they stored food. I mean, doing everything they did, we were doing was a war crime, and it was hardly being reported at all. And he went there to see it for himself and then to report it. And he wrote an incredible book that I hope you've all seen at some point, called The Fire This Time, about what he saw in Iraq and then what he thought needed to be said to the Americans about what they probably didn't know was going on. But he says the press rendered First Amendment protection meaningless because its wealthy owners uncritically supported the government as it destroyed Iraq. TV coverage was more a long-running commercial for war, weapons systems, and militarism than for news coverage. The tragedy of our time is that we celebrate the power of violence and not the pity of it. I think I'm gonna, with that, I mean, got 270 portraits, 270 stories, and a lot of them have to do with War and Peace, and could go on and on. But I think I would rather hear from you all now, and either hear your comments or try to answer some questions that you may have. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and hopefully we'll talk some. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert. So yeah, folks, you can put your questions and comments in the chat and we will get to those. And I'll start with one, which is, what's next for you? I guess you've done so many portraits, and I've looked at the website and just kind of all the different things that have come out of the project with the books and the whole website. And so I guess, yeah, can you tell us kind of what's the next step in this process for you?
Well, there are several next steps. And one is that the portraits continue to travel literally all over the country to schools, colleges, churches, etc. And I often get a chance to go with them and talk about what this means and who the people are. And we like to say that these are models of courageous citizenship. So when we get into schools, we can present them to young people as models for them to emulate if we can. And we get them doing projects around a whole host of issues, because the portrait series encompasses, at least I try to have it encompass, as many different issues that take perseverance and courage that I possibly can. And so at this time, because of all the traveling and talking and writing and educational work, I don't get anywhere near as many portraits painted anymore. And also I'm getting to be an old guy and slowing down, but I'm still painting them. And I mean, I noticed that I see the name Anne Lown up there. And one of the people I'm determined to paint, hopefully that she will help me do, is her father. Bernard Lown is an amazing figure from Lewiston, Maine, one of the world's great cardiologists who died a couple of years ago, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for the International Organization of Physicians to do something about nuclear war. And I just got his big autobiography, and I plan to read that and then paint his portrait. And I hope to talk to you in the future about doing that together. And then unveiling the portrait in Lewiston, where that's the one thing we do a lot of now. When I paint a new portrait, we take it somewhere and unveil it. I was just in St. Louis. We had a show of environmental portraits sponsored by the St. Louis Coalition for the Environment, and unveiled a new portrait there of an environmental activist. So, okay, I'm ready for anything else.
Wonderful. Yes, we have a question here from Suzanne. Do you write right on the paintings? Wow, you have to trust yourself to get that right the first time.
I actually, the paintings are painted on wooden panels that are 36 by 30 inches. And I scratch with a dental tool, the kind of little hook tool that the dentist scratches around between your teeth with. I scratch the words into the surface of the painting when the painting's dry. And well, you're sort of right and also sort of wrong. I misspell not infrequently. And when I do, there's a little bit of a crisis, because often I haven't saved the background color, and I've got to reinvent the color and then fix the mistake and then fix the word. But I've done that numerous times, and I've read right through it so many times and then misspelled it. Luckily, I have people who I get to read it who tell me that I've made a misspelling. I don't think I've ever put one out in public with a misspelling.
A question here from Kathy Kelly. What do you believe are the greatest threats that we all face in our world today?
Oh my God. Well, geez, I'd like her to answer that question. But I would say it's, we are still in the position where, and we have been, because of the way we think about economy and capitalism and jobs and all that stuff, that often we are, I mean, in the most serious way, we derive our ethics from what's good for economy rather than what's good for people or good for the world or what's moral. And as long as we do that, whether we're talking about environment or militarism or politics or anything, if that's if that's the bottom line, is, what's good for economy, and especially what's good for people with power in that economy, um, I'm not very sanguine about where we're going to go and how these things are going to end up. And of course, we're at this moment, because of the level of militarism and because of the urgency of the climate situation, that we really can't continue to do this and expect to survive. So I don't know, I'd be really interested in other people's comment on that very question.
Yeah, I'm seeing a few comments in the chat. Nuclear weapons, of course, comes to mind. Someone else suggests a universal basic income would help address this question.
Yeah, drop money in bombs instead of bombs.
Another question is, can you tell us a little bit more about your process of how you choose the people that you paint? Like, do you get recommendations from them, or like what, from someone that you painted who recommends someone else, or how do you find all these people?
Well, probably 3/4 of the paintings have come about as a result of recommendations. When I started with all these, icons, and then I moved to the 19th century and then up into the early 20th century, painting civil rights leaders, W.B. Du Bois, then Dr. King and Rosa Parks. But as I was going along, I was hearing all these other stories, and people would say, "Oh, you painted Rosa Parks. Why haven't you painted Claudette Colvin?" Or when I painted Howard Zinn, I asked him who he would paint, and he said Fannie Lou Hamer. I thought, oh my God, I haven't painted Fannie Lou Hamer. So many of the portraits have come about as result of suggestions. Many of them were people I had never heard of, and that had incredible stories. And often the choices I make the hardest thing is whom to leave out. I could have painted, if I could paint fast enough, I could have painted thousands of portraits by now, and they all deserve to be in there. But I can't do that, and so I have to leave out a lot of people, and fill up a certain sort of segment of our history with some people, and then leave others out. And that's the most painful thing about this, is I can't paint everybody, but I have to paint. I'm often looking for a story that's going to be particularly powerful in a school. The thing is that I get, which is so amazing to me, is I get into schools. I get into talking to kids at all different ages, from second grade, through graduate school, and can tell these stories. And, often I'm met with anger, not anger because of who the people are, but anger from students because they haven't been told these stories. And that's really interesting, that they don't know the people who could be role models for them, that they should know about, that make them feel good about themselves and what they could possibly do in the world. That's important.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting point what you said about how it's maybe easier for you to get into the schools with the art than it would be, let's say for David Swanson himself to get in, and kind of just, yeah, the sort of cultural element that's a draw for people. I'm wondering, do you have like a presentation that people can use to bring it to different clubs or schools in their local area with some talking points where they could tell these stories?
Oh, well, absolutely. They can get in touch with us through the Americans Who Tell the Truth website, and we can suggest many different ways. But you're absolutely right. A lot of schools that David Swanson wouldn't get into, I can take his portrait in, because people feel much more comfortable with the art than with a scary person who's got a real strong opinion about something. He's not a scary person at all. He's just a guy who knows a ton of stuff and will tell it. But I can go in there with his portrait and then say some of those same things. And it's pretty remarkable that they accept the art and think it's defanged, but it isn't, and then they get away with it.
Thanks. I'm going to pass it to Larry. Larry, do you have any questions or comments?
Well, I do. By the way, when you talked about Dr. Bernard Lown, I was mayor of Lewiston when we named a bridge in honor of Dr. Bernard Lown, and it's called the Bernard Lown Peace Bridge. And Robert is going to be painting Dr. Lown, so I was really pleased to hear that. he just passed away a couple of years ago at 99 years old. And his wife, the year earlier, and she was as much of a peace activist as he was. And she was the force behind him and always there in support, as are members of his family. And Anne Lown is in the audience here today. I wanted to mention a quote that I heard once, and it was by a Vietnamese colonel. And he said that in every war, it matters not who won or lost. The people always lose. And that is so true. What we're seeing happening in Ukraine right now, the people are losing. And that happens in every war. In Vietnam, we killed over 3 million people. We lost 58,000 soldiers by direct killing, but we don't know the count for suicides and everything else that came afterwards. And so anyway, I first heard of Robert Shetterly through Veterans for Peace and World Beyond War. And he was, I talked to him in Portland recently when we had the Veterans for Peace sailboat that was on a tour all this past year. Started off in Minneapolis, came down, it was Mississippi River, down through the Gulf to Cuba, and then on up the East Coast. And so, and Robert had many of his paintings there when we had an evening at DeMello's floating restaurant. And that's when I asked him to do this presentation tonight, and he graciously agreed. And so I think we're on the start of a friendship and work together. So I'm looking forward to working with Robert.
Right. So just to those of you who, if you aren't familiar with the project, go to the Americans Who Tell the Truth website, which is just AmericansWhoTellTheTruth.org, and you can click on the portrait gallery and see all the portraits, and click on any one of the portraits and read a biography of the person. And then you can go to the educational page and read about the different kinds of educational work we do. And then you can also see a section called Speaking Truth to Youth, where many of the living portraits have been interviewed for 10 to 15 minutes about where their inspiration comes from, where their hope comes from, and what advice they have for young activists, because these are all, those little videos get presented in schools all over the country. So kids are getting to know the people in the portraits, not just the portrait and the quote, but see a video of that person talking about why they do what they do. One of the portraits that I, when you said, Larry, about that quote about the people losing, in one of the portraits I didn't talk about, but I had on that presentation tonight, was Chanafa Kambangsa, who started the organization Legacies of War. She's a Laotian American, and she's been working for years to get international help cleaning up all the cluster bombs out of the Plain of Jars in Laos. There are still, it's estimated, some vast number, 20 million, cluster bombs. I mean, this whole thing recently with, the United States saying, yes, we use cluster bombs in Ukraine. I mean, they should have been talking about the effect that these have. They're still blowing up in Laos. People are still dying from them. Children are still having their legs blown off. Kids are still being blinded by them. Farmers are being, killed by them. These were dropped in the 1970s. The people can, they don't just lose in the war, but they continue to lose for years and years and years afterwards, by the decimated landscapes, but also what's been left behind that continues to explode and ruin their lives. So, I mean, this is, it's interesting though, when you go into a school and talk about the history of Vietnam. First of all, kids today aren't taught that history. And they certainly aren't taught about what happened in Laos or Cambodia. They have no idea. They never even heard of it, much less be able to find the countries on a map. So, but that's one of the efforts of this project, is to make that history alive, bring it back, and also talking about the people who are still working so steadfastly and courageously to do something about it.
Thank you, Robert. And there's a few questions for people coming in about booking you for speaking tours and different locations. So how do people do that?
Sure, that's wonderful. If they go to the Americans Who Tell the Truth website, and right up there in the top right, there's a little contact button, and you can send a request to me through that contact, and we'll get right back to you. We have an operations person, a woman named Christy Gonzalez. So Christy and I will, one of the others of us will answer and tell you all the logistics and issues and costs of bringing a show to anywhere, because we've gone everywhere. We'd love to.
That's wonderful. Great. All right. Well, we're just getting towards the end. I want to tell you, Robert, a lot of wonderful comments have been coming in the chat. People have really appreciated this presentation. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. And I'll pass it to you, Robert, or to you, Larry, if either of you have any final comments.
Larry, you're muted.
I simply want to say again a big thank you for doing this, and I hope that people go to the site, because you see the 270 or so paintings, and it's really well worth spending time on that website, and it can give us a sense of hope. And I only wish you could do a session in front of a joint, do a presentation in front of a joint session of Congress, and make them realize, what good they could do. They're there to serve us, and what good they could do instead of all the damage that they are creating by being complicit and bringing us along in that in being complicit with them and through our taxes. So.
Let me can I have a couple of minutes just to tell a quick little story? So one of the stories I love to tell, which I knew nothing about when I started this, I mean, the biggest educational part of this whole project has been my own, was learning the story of Claudette Colvin, who was a 15-year-old girl who 9 months before Rosa Parks sat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, the same city, and refused to move. I mean, she had not been trained, like Rosa Parks. She was just outraged that this was happening to her again. But everything else was the same. She was sitting in the front row, the black section, the white section filled up. She was ordered to go to the back, and she refused. She said, "The Constitution allows me to sit here." This, of course, did not go over very well on that bus, and eventually she was dragged off the bus, and the whole time saying, "The Constitution allows me to sit here." Curiously, the case that went to the Supreme Court, which actually ended bus segregation in Montgomery, was not Rosa Parks' case. It was a 15-year-old girl's case. It was Claudette Colvin's case. And that is really important. That's a great message for kids to know, is that, and I've painted a lot of very young people who have had huge success in changing things in this country, who've had the courage and the audacity to object, to commit civil disobedience when adults were not doing that. And their book was written about her a few years ago. And when the book won the National Book Award, and a man named Philip Hose wrote the book, Claudette Colvin, Twice Towards Freedom, I think it's called, or Justice, something, one of the other words. Anyway, and at the awards ceremony, she was asked, Claudette was there, and she was asked why she didn't move, because of course, she'd been taught by her parents that, when you're confronted by white people in a situation like that, do what they say, because they may, if they don't like what you're doing, they may blow up your house. They may attack your school, your church. Horrible things can happen to you. They may lynch you. And Claudette said, well, I wanted to move. She said, I tried to get up. Her school, by the way, her black high school in Montgomery had just gone through Negro History Week. And so she had been acquainted with all these people from her past that had done great things. And they told her, they had taught her this history. And she said, I tried to get up. I wanted to go to the back like they told me to. When I tried to stand up, I felt Harriet Tubman's hand on my shoulder, pushing me back down. She said, I tried to get up again, and I felt Sojourner Truth's hand on my other shoulder, pushing me back down. She said, I then had to ask myself, what would they do? And of course, there was only one answer. They wouldn't move. And she said, I had to stay there then. The reason I tell that story is because telling this history and knowing what people did in the past, the courage they had to stand up against whatever kind of injustice it is, and the price they paid, having those models in your head when we're inevitably, all of us get confronted with those moments, having those models and knowing who we want to stand with, who can give us courage at that moment, changes our lives. And that's why I continue to keep painting these portraits, and why I think it's so important that we carry this message, keep trying to get this message into schools, trying to make this country be as woke as it possibly can, because it has to be. It has to account for its own history. And that's the last thing I'd like to say is, to me, that's why I do it, because I need to tell those stories. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you for sharing these stories with us. And thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's event. And thank you to Larry for organizing all of this. So thank you. And we will send out the recording afterwards.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
It wouldn't be possible without Greta.
Thanks, Greta.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.